Thank you for listening. And thank you to the organizers for the honor of speaking at the UK Cognitive Linguistics Conference 2020. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the crazy times we live in. I know I don't just speak for myself when I say that it is quite amazing that despite months of lockdowns, setbacks, caring commitments, and just general stress, so many people are here virtually presenting their work. What are core properties of language and what is more marginal? There is great diversity in theories of language, of course, but they do tend to agree on what's absolutely crucial, say morphosyntax, and what is more marginal, say interjections. This view from a few centuries ago is entirely typical. The dominion of speech is erected on the downfall of interjections. It's easy to find recent versions of that sentiment. But here I want to turn that view on its head and ask, where would we be, linguistically speaking, if it wasn't for interjections? I organized my talk around 3 theses, and this is the first one. One can have interjections without language, perhaps, but not language without interjections. It's easy to agree with Mr. Tuck, though, when looking at sentence structure. We like to study things like how grammatical elements relate to each other, how information is packaged, how individual words and constituents are ordered, how frequent they are, feeding into predictions of rates of change or perhaps order of learning, and we could add many levels: phonology, phonetics, processing. But note that all of that is drilling down the structure of the utterance essentially along one dimension. It tends to treat the utterance as occurring in a vacuum. No context, no communicative goals, no people involved, except perhaps an idealized speaker-hearer, or as I prefer, producer-perceiver. And yet, virtually every utterance we encounter, of course, does occur in a particular situation as part of a conversation between actual people. This one is a case in point. It's from a conversation in which 2 people talk about a golf course. The topic is incidental, but what I want to highlight is the structure. We can see things that conversation analysts have identified as a pre-proposal, an assessment, a second position assessment. And note that some of this is hierarchical. So that pre-proposal up there ultimately leads to a proposal, but in between, other interactional work is being done, including, for instance, a little side sequence where they step away from the main business for a moment to resolve some trouble and then get back. This is interaction. It's the ecology, the evolutionary landscape of linguistic resources. That's an insight recognized in typology, in evolutionary linguistics, in some quarters of cognitive linguistics, but I think it's fair to say that it hasn't made a serious dent in the practices of many of us. Now, even without getting into all the detail about the structure of interaction, let's note something obvious about this dialogue. It is littered with little words. Up to 1 in every 5 utterances in a one cross-linguistic study features words like this. So if complex language is a pinnacle of human achievement, why do we still have to resort to lowly interjections all the time? My proposal is that it may be the other way around. Perhaps we owe at least some of the complexity of language to these little words. Consider this. Complex syntax shines in storytelling. That's an insight that goes back a long way. One recent take on it that I like is by Tomasello, who points out that the functional demands of narratives, where you relate a structured series of events displaced in space and in time, make it a prime place for what he calls fancy syntax. And some neat experimental work by Janet Bavelas shows how important both the producer of the story and the audience are for something like fancy syntax. What Bavelas and colleagues did is they had people tell personal stories, and they had listeners in 2 conditions. In one of them, the listeners provided the kinds of responses you expect, going mm-hmm and nodding and so on. They just had to act as a listener would. In the second condition, the listeners were also listening very attentively, but for a different reason. They were counting the number of words starting with T. And this pretty much inhibited all their capacities to go and so on. What's the result? Well, it turns out the stories spin out of control without these kinds of responses. So they were told at an unnatural pace, the delivery became much more repetitive, and the syntax became all chopped up. Or let's look at the second word in that little dialogue, a word like huh, as a form of conversational repair. In our own comparative work, we have found that repair initiations like that are incredibly common. They happen on average every 84 seconds in a global, diverse sample of mostly unrelated languages. So without repair, our interactions would be constantly derailed. So we've relegated these words to the margins, but actually they seem to have clear and crucial functions. The first one is a continuer, a word signaling you won't take the floor, and the other can go on. And note, by the way, the nice iconic indexical shape of this item, something that's been observed by Rod Gardner. You keep your lips sealed and go signifying that you won't be taking the floor and the other can go on. The next one is a repair signal, one of the things that enables us to gracefully recover from misunderstandings. Third here is a change of state token, so showing something like information received. And there may well be more of them, of course. Now, these little words can be thought of as basic interactional tools. And I want to argue they are far from inarticulate grunts. Instead, they are highly adaptive, communicative tools that help to streamline our interactions every single minute. This is not the outskirts of language. This is right where the action is. These are the words that help us talk and think. They are the words that greatly increase the error tolerance of our communication system. And they are resources that scaffold complex language. Now, a word about that metaphor, scaffold. We tend to think of scaffolding as temporary material, to be discarded and disregarded once a building is completed in all its glory and permanence. But with language, every new utterance is as fleeting and ephemeral as the last. The resulting system may be complex, and this is what we like to focus on as linguists, but every single element of it has to pass through that precarious, time-sensitive, rickety process of interactive language use. So to get to the level of complex language, we need reliable scaffolding at every turn in interaction. A note on terminology, by the way. This is, of course, thoroughly interdisciplinary territory. So the items that I just called interactional tools may be known to you as, say, conversational sounds or pragmatic markers or response tokens or back-channel messages. And rather than worrying about the wealth of terminology here, I've come to appreciate how these terms represent different construals of a phenomenon. So some of them foreground the metalinguistic nature of these resources, others their interactive nature. Yet others show that these things tend to be multimodal. And of course they are responsive and they have social and pragmatic dimensions. All of these are the backdrop to the phenomenon that I'm talking about here. But what's most striking, though, is that most of the work cited here is on English and a handful of other major languages. We know actually very little about this system across languages. And that is the point of departure of the research program I talk about today. Elementary particles of conversation. We ask three main questions. First, we want to understand the minimal inventory of interactional tools. Languages probably differ, but the thinking here is that there must be a handful of functions for which basically every language needs to have a set of resources in order to even function as a language. And we need to discover what that minimal inventory is of interactional tools. Now, this of course implies already comparative work, and that's the second question. How universal or language specific might that toolkit of interactional tools be? For this, we do comparative research across a range of languages, spoken and signed. And the third question here is, how do interactional tools scaffold complex language? These are interrelated questions, each coming with their own set of methods. And I want to touch on all three of them, starting with the first two. And on the first two, I will give an example from our own prior work on one of these interactional tools. Namely, a basic word for initiating repair. And the story of this word is that in the course of a larger comparative project on repair in human interaction, we stumbled upon something that suspiciously looked and sounded like a universal word. So in over 30 languages, we found a word that sounds like huh, for precisely the function of initiating repair, for essentially saying something like come again, or what was that? So in all of those languages, not only was there a way to initiate repair, but one of the available ways was incredibly similar across all those languages. Why would that be? You can look up the paper if you want, but what we think is going on here is a form of convergent cultural evolution. Basic idea here is that these items do not occur in a vacuum. Their home is interaction, and a particular place in interaction, moreover. At any point in interaction, we're under a couple of pressures. We need to plan and articulate what we are saying, which takes time. We also know that delays are pragmatically meaningful, so we tend to try to minimize delays in responding. Overall, we do this quite well. So turn taking is rapid. We only need 200 milliseconds on average to start a turn when the other has finished their turn. And I'll come back to this later in the lecture as well. But the basic idea here is that these pressures converge into a communicative need that all languages share. All languages sometimes run into trouble, of course, and so they gravitate towards similar repair signals. What you need under these pressures of turn taking and formulation and timing, you need something that's easy to plan, that's quick to produce, and that has questioning, prosody, putting the ball back in the court of the person who produced the troublesome turn. So you need something that you could call the simplest possible question word. In spoken languages, that is huh, with all articulators in near neutral position and just a hint of questioning prosody. You have your simplest possible question word. But note that this holds across modalities. Although sign languages obviously don't have something like huh as a spoken syllable, they are predicted to have a minimal repair initiator that is easy to plan and quick to produce and has questioning prosody. For instance, in Argentine Sign Language, studied by my colleague Elizabeth Manrique, there's a similar minimal interjection-like repair initiator, a non-manual sign consisting of little more than eyebrows together and sometimes raised. The simplest possible question word in this particular sign language. Now, since we published this, the prediction that we made has been borne out strongly with a growing number of attestations worldwide. I just mentioned a couple of spoken languages here in which it's been shown. It's work on signed languages has less conversation material available to look at this, but the prediction there is also expected to be borne out. I'd be very interested to learn more if you have more data, and always up for a collaboration. There is also an interesting boundary case, Danish, where we find a form that's most clearly a part of the WH question word paradigm, glosed as what instead of huh. But phonetically, it's nearly indistinguishable from something like ah. And so perhaps what's going on here is that this is gradually being loosened from the grip of its paradigm of question words and getting caught up in the vortex of selective pressures. That's a prediction that we won't know about this until about 100 years. So much for one interactional tool and its universality and limited and constrained diversity across languages. How about the prediction of other kinds of words? Do I have more examples? Well, actually, take a delay marker. The interactional tool of a delay marker has a couple of functions, but one of them is to keep the floor and show that you're basically searching for words while holding on to your turn. So you're essentially saying that you do want to speak, you are going to speak, but you're just getting your thoughts in order and finding the right words. What are the requirements for such a function? Well, one thing is it needs to be stretchable, because you don't know how long this word search is going to take. It also better be articulatorily minimal, because it needs to be easy to plan. You're already occupied with a word search, so you don't want to spend precious resources also planning some complex articulatory motion. And that's more of a hypothesis, but I think it's also useful if that delay marker occupies the main articulators, as if to indexically say, I am going to sign or speak. And this is exactly, of course, what we find in this ASL sign that I showed here, and in an English word like or for that matter, a Dutch word, which sounds very much the same, or a Siwu word, a language that I study spoken in Ghana, which again sounds quite similar. Some of those similarities have been drawn out for a small number of languages by Clark and Fox-Tree. The basic idea here that excites me is that this could be another case of convergent cultural evolution, and again also holding across modalities. So as long as we're able to frame our search in terms of functional requirements and in terms of a clear interactional ecology in which we expect an item, we will be able to find items that serve that function, and we will be able to study the degree to which they are similar across languages or different. So in sum, humble words like huh or or are in fact highly adaptive words that help us talk and think. They could well be sites of convergent cultural evolution across modalities. They are also good examples of the ways in which language is shaped by and for social interaction. And I want to argue they are scaffolds for metacognition. Now, before I go on to the second thesis, I want to say a little bit more about the conceptual backdrop to the project. In this research, I think of language as, first of all, a generative set of tools. That's an idea grounded in a broad range of work, of course. For von Humboldt, it was making infinite use of finite means. Zipf's metaphor for this was a toolbox, a range of different tools, each designed or evolved for its own purpose and endlessly combinable into creative combinations. Now, these tools can be thought of as cultural as well as cognitive. In fact, with language, it's best to see these as two sides of the same coin. These tools are not abstract labels. They live and evolve in interaction. That's where we learn them. That's where they adapt or die. And this kind of perspective, language as a form of joint action, is equally important for the work I report on today. So that generative, social, interactional perspective on linguistic resources animates the work I report on today. It's not the only way to look at language, but it is one that has led to a number of discoveries that seem at least a little bit interesting. Putting this in the perspective of linguistic theorizing more broadly, I think it's fair to say that most approaches, whether they bill themselves as broadly generativist or cognitive, have a strong focus on knowledge of language. They may differ in where they think that knowledge comes from, but they are primarily interested in the cognitive basis of language. The approach I'm taking here acknowledges this as important, but it points out we may have neglected the life of language in interaction as one force shaping and constraining its structure. Now, the research we embarked on is inspired by a range of work. I want to highlight 3 lines of work that are particularly important to it First, this short and sweet book by Nick Enfield, my longtime collaborator and colleague, in which Enfield traces the lives of linguistic items and systems across different frames, causal temporal frames. By the way, this book is open access, so you can easily just download it from the Language Science Press website. Now, the frames include the microgenetic, the ontogenetic, the phylogenetic, and so on. And Enfield's point, one of the points in this book, is that often we focus on only one of them, but the most productive accounts of linguistic structure work out how these levels of analysis connect. Another thing this book does is lay out the anatomy of interaction as a back and forth between the private and the public, and identifying 4 places where there are transmission biases that can play a role in the cultural evolution of linguistic resources. Second line of work that I want to highlight here is by the philosopher Andy Clark on material symbols. As Clark points out, going back a long way even to his work with Chalmers on the extended mind, the material structures of language reflect and transform our thinking and our reasoning. One well-known example is that having labels supports abstraction and enhances your attention abilities. But as he also points out, language allows thinking and talking about talking and thinking in a way that is unmatched in other communication systems that we know of. And this actually enables us to shape, to an important degree, our own mental and our own social worlds, which he sees as a form of epistemic engineering. One opportunity I see in this work is that this is still a mostly individualist account. There's not a lot of attention to the interactional foundations of language and its material properties. The third line of work that I want to highlight and that I take inspiration from is by Celia Hayes on cognitive gadgets. And cognitive gadgets for Hayes are culturally evolved mechanisms of thoughts. As examples, she gives imitation, mind reading, normative thinking, causal reasoning. Importantly, for Hayes, these are not cognitive instincts, as some have defined these things, but for her they are culturally transmitted pieces of technology embodied in the brain. End quote. What this means is that they are passed on through social interaction. That part of it does remain underspecified though, and that's where I see another opportunity. So this is a strictly cognitive account, I think it's fair to say, with not a lot of attention to interactive language or to the possibility that some of these cognitive gadgets may also have material properties. In fact, what I would want to propose is that the kinds of interactional tools that I've talked about so far can be seen as material metacognitive tools. So these lines of work and more shape the overall orientation of the research program. And one way of summarizing it would be to say that I'm interested in language as shaped by and for social interaction. So in the project I ask, how do linguistic resources enable interactively scaffolded, materially augmented and socially distributed cognition? On to the second thesis then. It's deliberately provocative and in fact a little pompous, I'll admit. Interactive repair is to language as DNA repair is to life. Here's the idea. Biological life, as we know, depends on DNA replication. This is a continuous process and it is not without faults. Every cell in our body has a complex set of mechanisms for correcting this incredibly complicated process, and that's collectively known as DNA repair. Life as we know it depends on these processes. And so it is with language, or so I claim. Human language as we know it could not exist without interactive repair. That's a big claim. It also corresponds to one of the key questions in our project that I mentioned before. How do interactional tools scaffold complex language? How do we test a question like that? Well, in at least 3 ways. We need experiments, we need observation to establish a baseline of what happens and what doesn't happen. And we also use computational modeling. I want to start with the experimental side. Now, this is work with Marlou Razenberg, who I co-supervise with Asle Özürek. And I work together with Marlou in the Communicative Alignment in Brain and Behavior lab. What we work on in this project is the question of how people negotiate mutual understanding in multimodal interaction. And one of the things we do here is collect data in a director-matcher task. That's a task in which people talk about 16 so-called fribbles, novel 3D objects, that they need to identify and locate over 6 rounds in 16 trials in each round. So they talk a lot about these forms for which they start out not having any labels or words. And over the course of these conversations, of course, there's a lot of negotiation going on of which fribble is intended. Here's one example. So the target fribble is shown here, but of course for the participants it would appear in an array of 16 fribbles that are sometimes hard to distinguish from one another. And so in what we could call the presentation phase, in terms of Clark and Wilkes-Gibbs, the first participants here says, and then you have on the front, I don't see so many of those, a big block like this, and makes a tracing gesture, a one-handed tracing gesture of that block that I've highlighted up there in the shape of the fribble. Then what follows is an expansion or a repair sequence in which we get more information, but also a check, an understanding check. So the other person goes, that goes straight down like this, and produces a two-handed tracing gesture, seemingly referring to that same block. And then what follows is a resolution of the repair sequence, in which the speech signals acceptance. Yes, exactly. But there's also another instance of this same gesture that traces the outline of the rectangle or block-like shape in space. So it's interesting to note that the speech by itself already signals acceptance, but it's the mimicked gesture that helps to show in a more definite manner that the reference has indeed been understood completely. So speech and gesture work together here in mutual understanding. One simple thing that we learn from this work, which replicates, of course, decades of work on interaction in these kinds of tasks, is that mutual understanding is never simply imparted. It's not just that we speak some words and the other understands. It actually requires continuous coordination and calibration. What we find is that repair is especially common in early rounds and early trials, and that's when it helps calibrate and streamline the referring expressions that people ultimately arrive at. And in some of the ongoing work, what we're doing is we trace the divergence and the convergence across speech and gesture, across semiotic resources in social interaction. We actually have a preprint out on that that you can look up, which is about the phenomenon of alignment or entrainment, or whatever you want to call it, and which is in which we present a multidimensional framework that we can use to understand these kinds of convergence and divergence. What we're also doing is tracking the role of repair in calibrating and updating people's representations. And I want to call attention here, by the way, to a line of work, experimental work also, by Gregory Mills. Gregory Mills has developed some very clever methods to manipulate where and when repair occurs. And that kind of work also shows the crucial role of repair in coming to terms, so to say, in shaping communicative strategies. And so shows repair to play a really important role in making complex language possible. So let's back up a little bit. We're asking how interactional tools scaffold complex language. And the first method that I highlighted was experimentation. The second is observation, to establish a baseline of what happens. And one good place to do observation is to look at little people, folks that are still in the process of acquiring the system of interactional tools that we're interested in, but also the larger system of complex language that these are part of, and that they help scaffold, is the claim. One interesting thing that we know about infant interactions is that 50% of them, at least according to one study on American English, I think, 50% of infant-initiated interactions features repair to negotiate meaning. You may feel sorry for these poor infants, but actually this is good news, because these kinds of interactional structures help scaffold linguistic development, as has long been known in work on language development. They do so in a couple of ways. They provide, first of all, repeated exposure to words, so that helps build the lexicon. They also help by calibrating meaning in context, so that helps build pragmatic awareness. And most intriguingly for present purposes, they highlight, present and promote compositional structure. So they help build grammar or morphosyntax, or as you might say, compositionality. And let me just highlight the way repair could play a role in this. So, given a sentence, given an utterance like Sibby's sister had a baby boy, there are of course a range of ways in which you can initiate repair if you didn't quite understand. One would be to go, huh? And the scope of that repair expression would be the full term. So it leaves open what or where the problem is. This is why we call a repair initiator like that an open repair initiator. But another way, and this is the actual attested way that happened for this particular term in a classic study of repair, another way would be to go who, in which case you would highlight another part of the term. But you could also say Jenny, or she what, or a boy, and in doing so, these different forms of repair highlight different parts of the sentence, ultimately serving as kind of a searchlight for morphosyntactic structure. So what you could say then is that repair may be one of the things that helps learners break into morphosyntax. Repair as a system may be a highly effective way for making linguistic structure visible. This is the sense in which conversation analysts have spoken about repair as relevant to syntax for conversation. One thing that's interesting about this is that it touches on many things that linguists of all stripes have taken a keen interest in. Sluicing, echo questions, WH fronting, all of these phenomena have transparent functional roots in the question system, and ultimately they are especially common in repair sequences. Now, observation gives us a baseline of what's attested and what we want to account for. Experiments allow some degree of manipulation to test causal claims. Another good way to put causal claims to the test and to sharpen theories is to build formal computational models. And that's the third method we use to test interactional scaffolding. This is work with Marieke Woensdrecht and others in the project Elementary Particles of Conversation. We are using modeling to address several questions, and I just want to briefly review our findings for the first. How does feedback shape linguistic complexity and communicative success? There's a second one that I'll save for when we get to the third and last thesis of the talk. So, repair and compositional structure then. Compositionality is of course a hallmark of complex language. There's some nice modeling work by Simon Kirby and colleagues that shows something about the conditions in which it may emerge. They look at pressures of learnability and expressivity. If something needs to be learnable, it means it needs to be simple enough to commit to memory. And so you could think that the simplest possible language in terms of learnability would be one that consists of only one sign or symbol. But that wouldn't be very expressive. And that's the other thing we require of our language. We want to talk about a range of different meanings, and if at all possible, using different kinds of words. So these pressures pull in opposing directions. But what Kirby et al. Show is that if you put them together, their interaction swings the balance in favor of a compositional system, a linguistic system that is highly compressible, i.e. learnable, but also highly expressive. That's a neat result using a very elegant model. What we do in our modeling work is we take that as a point of departure, but we take a complementary approach by abstracting away from learnability for a moment and instead looking at the dynamics of noise and repair. Our hypothesis is that repair can facilitate the emergence of compositional structure under noise. The basic idea is inspired by the observational work I just cited, where repair gives learners a grip on compositional structure. You can look up the paper, by the way, and the full modeling details online. This is Woensdrecht and Dingemanse 2020 in Ivo Lang. So I'm going to be brief. What we find is that given noise and pressures for minimal effort and mutual understanding, what repair allows you to do is the proportion of compositional languages relative to holistic languages increases. Holistic languages are the kinds of languages where there's a single signal for every single meaning, but there isn't internal structure to the signals. Compositional languages, on the other hand, have internal structure. And the basic idea is that what repair enables you to do, if you have a compositional language, it enables you to reach mutual understanding with relatively minimal effort, because then you can take advantage of the partial interpretability of signals. Part of a holistic signal is still meaningless, but part of a compositional signal might be meaningless, especially if you have repair to retrieve the rest of that signal. So in future work, we want to explore interactions with learnability, also with different types of repair, because obviously it's going to matter what types of repair you have available for how it can influence the structure of your language. But this modeling work, I highlighted it because it gives us a way to formalize our thinking about how repair may scaffold linguistic complexity. So in sum then, interactive repair is to language as DNA repair is to life. Experimental work shows repair to be crucial in calibrating minds and bodies. The observational work that I've cited shows how it can help to preserve and promote compositional structure in language and linguistic systems. And modeling work suggests that repair can favor the emergence of compositional structure given noise. Time to move on to the third thesis. Language is interactively distributed cognition. It's of course a truism that language and cognition are closely intertwined, that you can't really study one without the other. Every linguist will agree, not just the ones that call themselves cognitive today. But we do tend to live in our head a bit as linguists, I think. And we do so at risk of forgetting that language lives in interaction. So interaction is crucial as a place where language helps us achieve distributed cognition. And I move back to Mr. Took for a moment, who said the dominion of speech is erected on the downfall of interjections. Interestingly, he did allow for one context in which we may sometimes need interjections. As he wrote, interjections are employed only when the shortness of time makes us for a moment forget the use of speech. The shortness of time. Did you see that? It went by pretty fast. That's how fleeting and ephemeral utterances are. And, apologies for the modality specific display here, but the point actually holds for sign language as well as for spoken languages. Utterances are ephemeral and they follow each other in rapid succession. Here is the average turn transition time in a typical corpus of informal interaction. So that's how long it takes between one person stopping and the other person starting their turn. The most frequent value, the mode here, is 200 milliseconds. That's about as fast as the blink of an eye. Now, producing a turn takes time, comprehending it takes time, and these processes need to be interleaved because we leave so little time in between, only 200 milliseconds. Here are some of the things that we need to do, that I need to do before my turn and therefore partly during yours. I need to be processing the incoming turn. I need to be trying to figure out what speech act or social action it tries to implement. I need to start planning my own production of my next turn, the response. But all the while, I'll also need to be predicting when the other turn is going to end. And then at some point, I need to launch my production. And all of this under a great deal of time pressure. So if this is a busy slide, that's the point. In interaction, we have loads to do with very little time. Actually, let's look at just one part of this process in a little more detail. Just consider the case of a turn and its interpretation. And even abstracting away from the psycholinguistics of planning and processing, there's a lot we do in the domain of interpretation. One promising approach in this area considers this to involve a form of reasoning called pragmatic reasoning. The idea is that in producing and interpreting signs, we take into account the other's perspective recursively. You may also know this as theory of mind, perspective taking, recursive viewpoint embedding, intersubjectivity. The wealth of terms again giving away that this is a thoroughly interdisciplinary area. So the basic idea is that green here could take blue's words just literally, but more often they will consider that some thought went into them. And blue conversely will likely apply that kind of pragmatic reasoning recursively. So there are multiple possible orders of pragmatic reasoning. You could be a literal order listener, a zero order, or you could be, up to pragmatic nth order. And that way of thinking, of course, grows recursively more complex. And note, by the way, that this is fully symmetrical. Now, pragmatic reasoning has been recently formalized under the heading of Rational Speech Act theory. And one nice thing about this theory is that it works quite well to predict one-shot communication and convention formation in the lab. So this is a formalization that helps explain some of the choices of formulation and interpretation that actual people use, at least in the lab. Now, this form of pragmatic reasoning is truly a formidable thing to do. It's along with compositionality, perhaps one of the other hallmarks of our linguistic abilities. There is, though, a slight problem, and that is that it is computationally quite costly, especially as lexicons grow. So one question is, how well does it scale? This is a question we explore in some new work with Jacqueline van Arkel, supervised by my colleagues Marieke Woensdrecht and Mark Blokpoel. What we do here is, here's the key idea. Repair may be actually one way to outsource this computational problem, to outsource computation in interaction. So you can think of people as having a repair heuristic. Interpret if you can, repair when you must. And you could think of this as a form of cognitive offloading in interaction. Now, what we do in this project is we build agents to compare two types of strategies that you might have here. One of them interactive. And an agent that has that strategy can negotiate meaning over several turns using something like repair. But they are a literal reasoner. So they can't actually engage in very complex pragmatic reasoning. The other type of strategy is a pragmatic strategy. Agents equipped with this strategy can use advanced pragmatic reasoning. They start out as a first order reasoner. They can even scale up if necessary, but they don't have the option to initiate repair. And the question that we ask is, when we pit these against each other, how do they trade off interactional and computational cost as a function of lexicon size? Note that the goal here is not to model exactly how this works in actual interaction. We know that people combine both strategies, but the point of modeling it is to try and disentangle the contributions of both interactive and pragmatic strategies. So here are some more details about how this model is built. Agents have a lexicon of signal referent mappings, and this lexicon has some degree of ambiguity. Without any ambiguity, for instance, if there was just a simple one-to-one mapping between signals and reference, there would of course be no need for any pragmatic reasoning or repair. So there is a degree of ambiguity in this lexicon. And then we define an event of communication as a case in which an agent signals some signal and another agent B infers some referent. So here's our signal, here's our probable referent. Now, along with this inference about the probable reference, of course, comes a degree of uncertainty, which we operationalize as the conditional entropy of a distribution over all of the reference, given the particular signal that agent A produced. So if a signal has low entropy, that means that there are actually relatively few references that are equally probable. So it's it's an unambiguous, quite clear signal. Whereas if it's high entropy, your signal is highly ambiguous. Now, say it's low entropy, we're able to commit to an interpretation. And then we can measure the degree of success, the degree to which the inferred referent matches the intended referent. And then finally, behind all this, of course, is some kind of cost. And in our case, we measure this in terms of the basic computation steps that are involved in this process, taking into account the size of the lexicon, which makes computations more complex if larger, and the number of turns, which of course also adds to the number of computations. Now, the case displayed here is a case of a high certainty signal, a low entropy signal, where our pragmatic agents can simply apply their reasoning, arrive at a very probable interpretation, and be done with it. Our interactive agent would actually be able to do the exact same thing because it's a high certainty signal. There is no need to engage in repair, and so they would also get their interpretation in order. The more interesting case, of course, is for a low certainty, a high entropy signal. So here we get that signal and we get our pragmatic reasoners being at a loss, not being able to commit to an interpretation because it is too uncertain. Now what they can do is they can scale up their level of pragmatic reasoning. They can do that again if they want. And then they commit to an interpretation, hopefully a more robust one at this point. Interactive agents don't have this option to scale up their pragmatic reasoning, but they can initiate repair. And then it gets interesting because they then get another signal and they can work with the conjunction of those two signals, signals S1 and S2, to reduce their referential uncertainty. So now perhaps they're able to commit to an interpretation. Or, of course, they may need another round of repair, get another signal, interpret the conjunction of all of the previous dialogue history. So note one interesting thing here and a crucial point. For the pragmatic agent, it is essentially all in the head. They can scale up their pragmatic reasoning, so reason more complexly, and thereby increase the likelihood that they arrive at the right referent. But that's all they can do. Whereas for the interactive agent, in a way, it's all in the interaction. What they can do is distribute the work over turns and over minds. This is the sense in which language can interactively distribute cognition. So what do the results look like? Let's first look at success. What we find is that our pragmatic agents actually do quite well for smaller lexicons. This is known territory, of course. 6x4 is a fairly typical lexicon size for this kind of model of rational speech act theory. But this kind of pragmatic agent fares a lot worse for the larger lexicons. How do interactive agents compare? They actually do better than the pragmatic agents for the larger lexicon sizes. They do seem to do a little bit worse for the smallest size. This is probably just because we picked a fairly lenient uncertainty threshold. So they actually didn't engage in any repair for the smallest lexicon size. If they had been doing that, they would have actually beaten the pragmatic agent also on that front. Now, what about cost? Because success is of course one thing, but if it costs you all sorts of computational resources, then that actually comes with a trade-off. For the pragmatic agent, what we find is that cost is really quite small, relatively speaking, for the smallest lexicons. Again, this is known territory. This is the kind of thing that has been studied. It's one reason why rational speech act theory applications have been so successful. But we start to see a problem for the larger lexicons. Computational cost actually scales quadratically with lexicon size for the pragmatic agents. What does the picture look like for the interactive agents? Here, the cost actually stays relatively low relative to the other agents. So they start out with really low cost. Essentially, they have to do almost nothing. They can be a literal listener, of course, for the smallest lexicon. But even for the larger lexicons, their way of distributing the work over turns and over minds makes it possible to reduce the costs. So it looks, based on this modeling work then, it looks like interactive repair can ease the computational burden imposed by something as complex and sophisticated as pragmatic reasoning. This is a form of cognitive offloading. We distribute work over minds and over turns. And in doing so, the interactive agents are able to achieve higher success rates at lower costs for larger lexicons. Some caveats here. We didn't implement asymmetry, so the agents have exactly the same lexicon, and we implemented only a single type of repair, triggered in a very simple way. If we add more complexity, obviously that would also bring in more computational cost. But then again, the goal is not to model exactly how this works in actual interaction, because again, it's clear that we use both repair and pragmatic reasoning. But the goal of a model like this is to formalize our intuitions. Now that we better understand the trade-off between pragmatic reasoning and repair, we can reason more clearly about everyday interaction, and we can design better experiments and better theories. So in sum then, language is interactively distributed cognition. Pragmatic reasoning is crucially important. It's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only one. And it's computationally costly and literally single-minded, all in one head. Interactive repair allows agents and perhaps also people to get away with simpler reasoning by distributing the cognitive labor. Which brings me back to the view of interactional tools I started out with at the beginning of the lecture. These tools are culturally evolved to help outsource computation and streamline interaction. Finally, to sum up the three theses. First, one can have interjections without language perhaps, but not language without interjections. Second, admittedly pompous, interactive repair is to language as the DNA repair is to life. And third, language is interactively distributed cognition. One way to take these things together is, if there's one message that I hope you take away from this, is it's that the interactional foundations of language in public conversations merit as much of our scientific attention as its cognitive basis in private minds. Thank you for listening. Thank you to my wonderful collaborators. Thanks again to the UKCLC organizers for the invitation, and thank you to the funders for their support of this work.